Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Vorkosigan Saga, Book Something, Cetaganda, chapters 7 and 8. In these chapters, well, I was right about Ivan's popularity with the ladies after that episode, so things are not as dire as he thought, evidently. And also, Miles figures out that he's got a lot more suspects to choose from, after all, and now things are much, much more complicated. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Jen for commissioning this episode. Jen, if you're out there, thank you. Appreciate you. High five. All of that good stuff. I am so puzzled at the direction that this book is going because I really thought that after everything that has happened so far with, oh my God, now I've forgotten his name. What is it? I keep wanting to say Yennefer, like Yennefer of Vengerberg from The Witcher. Our guy from the last chapters who held the party. I was thinking that we were sort of starting to decide that he was the one responsible for what was going on with the key, that everything was so linked up that we sort of took it like it was inevitably heading in that direction. And it seems like either he doesn't have anything to do with it, or he is just somebody, Yanaro, that's the one. Oh, thank God. But it seems like maybe the theory that we're working on at this point is simply he is a person who has been toying with Miles for his own reasons, going along with his own fun, and that there's just a general sense of animosity toward Miles. I'm not certain if it's meant to be because he's from Barrier, because of who he is specifically, and that maybe they don't have anything to do with each other. But it felt to me like the way that Miles was talking to Ivan in the last chapters, it felt to me like he was saying all of these things go together. And so when I think somewhere in these chapters, Ivan specifically says basically that he doesn't believe Yanaro would have the kinds of like high level contacts necessary to pull something like this off. I'm going to admit that I was like kind of surprised he was being taken off the board as a suspect, so to speak, here. And, we'll see where this goes, and maybe he'll be brought back. Maybe there's just not enough to tie him to it at this point. But, okay. The start of chapter 7, Ivan is still down in the infirmary, and Miles is just sort of thinking things through and looking up the, 8 satrap governors, the ones that would be given this data pool, basically, about their own genetics. And I'm trying to find the spot. Let's see. Each ruled his satrapy for a set term of only 5 years. Then he was required to shift, sometimes to permanent retirement back at the capital on Eta Ceta, sometimes to another satrapy. A couple of the older and more experienced men had cycled this way through the entire empire. The purpose of the term limitation, of course, was to prevent the buildup of a personal local power base to anyone who might harbor secret imperial pretensions. So, I guess the thought here is that if they were being offered this information, either the Dowager Empress wasn't worried about that, didn't think that this was going to be something that could be used in this way, or perhaps because of the way things went down, she had just not intended the order of events, you know? Um, he assumed Lord X had personally murdered Baalura. He could eliminate the weakest and most fragile elderly men, a premature assumption. And this is one of the things that I always think of later on. This is another issue that like Ivan brings up and sort of goes, well, how do we know such and such wasn't a coincidence? And Miles just responds with, we're trying to make this more simplified, sir. So we have to assign this to be a, like, not a coincidence, just to keep randomness out of the factors that we're considering here. And I am, this is something that I think about a lot in terms of like what it takes to investigate things and to pull a bunch of information apart and figure out what actually all works. Because I am definitely somebody who tends to want to hedge my bets. And there are so many times where I'm watching something or reading something, and people are just like, all right, well, because we believe that the motive is XYZ, we can eliminate these people from the suspect list. And I understand that we need to simplify things. Like I definitely get that in terms of the practical reasons we are having this meeting and talking this over, that is what we're aiming to do here. However, I never feel quite confident enough personally to absolutely say that the motive I believe we are working with is the correct one, and then use that to just take people's names off the list. Like, it just, I don't, I think this is part of me being just an overly cautious person. So I feel like if I tried to be a detective, we would just never get anywhere, because I would always just be, yeah, but like, we don't know that. So maybe we should just keep an eye on that, just in case, until a little bit later, and it would just wind up miring us in information because we're not making any decisions. And I kind of think that's part of what makes Miles not just like good at this kind of work, but just also a more decisive thinker. Is that he kind of, this isn't the first time that he has sort of had this moment where he's like, all right, I just have to assume certain things. And if I go with that, my course is clear. And I need to adopt this as like a means of making decisions myself a little bit more. I'm a Libra, guys. I'm not great at it. Just, I know that's like some astrological shit that a lot of people don't agree with or believe in or whatever. And maybe it's not because I'm a Libra. Maybe it's for other reasons. But all I know is I am a Libra, and I am also profoundly indecisive. And it's funny because once I make a decision, you would never know I'm indecisive, because I am a real, like, immovable bitch after a point. However, getting to the place where I have made the choice, that's the hard part. Um, so let's see, I'm trying to find the moment where Ivan comes in. It wasn't his task to solve the Boz murder anyway. It was his task to locate the real Great Key. And I couldn't help but laugh, because I was like, it's really not. Like, neither of those things. And considering he says here it's not his task to solve the Boz murder, the conversation that he has a little bit later, I was just like, suddenly it kind of is your task, isn't it, Miles? He's, yeah, just gonna do what I need to do in the moment, I suppose. That's the way it goes. Um, so Ivan comes in and tells him they were able to catch it, It does metabolize rapidly, but they said it would have been untraceable by morning if I hadn't gone down there right away. It was taken by mouth. And he says, no permanent harm done, Miles does. And Ivan replies, except to my reputation. And once again, I was just like, I don't know about that, buddy. And certainly, we find out later, he has gotten a lot of invitations to a lot of ladies' luncheons and whatnot, and he has nothing to worry about, evidently. And your boy is getting worn out. I can't help but wonder. Gennaro had intended for Ivan to be embarrassed. And then Ivan, turns and does something entirely different, and he winds up in a position where all the ladies are talking about him and want to get a piece. And I can't help but wonder what Gennaro is thinking, because he had really tried to do something here, and that is not how it went. Is he gonna try for something else? Is he gonna attempt to get back at him another way? What is his reaction? This is always the part with anything that I personally I can be very petty, you guys. I try to rise above it, and for the most part I succeed, just because pettiness really takes a lot of energy and a lot of attention. But when I am reading fiction and a character kind of bests somebody else in a silly sphere that maybe doesn't matter that much, I just wish I got to see it more often, because frequently that happens off camera. It's something that you smirk to yourself knowing that so and so is going to be pissed off at the thing, but not necessarily are you going to get the satisfaction of watching the moment where they realize. And I think what it comes down to, if I'm being perfectly honest, everybody, we want to have those moments where we see somebody realize their plans are foiled. And even when you do get to see them, those rare moments in life, often they aren't as satisfying as you wanted them to be. And I have learned this the hard way. I want a gratifying response that's very vocal, where they say I can't believe this is and usually when people realize that something they tried to do failed, they just sort of walk away from it, and they don't make a big deal out of it, because they don't want to give the satisfaction of having a tantrum. Even if you're not there to see it, they kind of keep it to themselves. And so the response you get is less than what you're hoping for anyway. But it's something that I have noted. There's a friend of mine who is going through a relationship thing right now. And suffice to say, the man is absolute trash, capital every letter. And he keeps on doing these things where he messages her and then doesn't reply, or he'll temporarily block and then unblock her, things like that. And she was saying the other day how bummed out she gets when he blocks her, because she wants him to see that she has read his messages and hasn't replied. Basically, she wants the satisfaction, right? And she's telling me this, and I'm like, girl, that you're never going to get what you want out of this. It's not, that's the point of the way that he is playing it, is so that he always has the upper hand and has complete control over all communication, so that you don't get to see him be upset about anything. That's the point. Anyway, I'm sorry guys, I really went off on a tangent there, but it's just something that I've noticed about myself and the way that I read things. So Ivan, predictably, is really trying to get Miles to let go of this whole thing and turn it over. Eventually, we have our Barry Yarin. He is with IMSEC, I believe, officially, but I keep thinking of him as sort of their chaperone, I guess. And Ivan just wants Miles to turn it over, and Miles keeps dodging. And I love that eventually, after Ivan has met the guy and they talk again, and Miles is like, did you mention such and such to him? And Ivan says no. Miles is then like, okay, well, I need you to talk to him again and drop this information and see how he responds. And Ivan is like, how do you, why don't you just talk to him yourself? And Miles doesn't exactly know how to answer. And he's like, well, I'm trying to minimize. And Ivan basically finishes the sentence with the number of times that you have to just outright lie to him. And even though Miles doesn't respond, that is dead accurate. That's completely what he is saying. Um, so let's see. Uh, so when do we report? Not yet, but I think we'd better start documenting it all. Personal logs. I've been doing that since the first day, Ivan informed him grimly. It's locked in my valise. Oh, good. Miles hesitated. I couldn't help but wonder about this. Like, is Miles upset that it turns out he's been doing this? Is he feeling like a little bit threatened by it? Is it simply the fact that he is suggesting it so belatedly and it turns out Ivan was doing it the whole time? I'm not really certain like how he's feeling about that, but I was sort of chortling to myself because understandably Miles often doesn't have a lot of great things to say about Ivan's intelligence. And no offense, Ivan, but there's a reason for that. However, there are moments here and there where he shows some real common sense simply because his aim is very much to just offload this fucking issue onto somebody. And because Miles is so much more hesitant on doing that, he is taking less action in a lot of senses. Um, Here it is. Did you plant the idea that Yanara has had a high-placed backer? I'd like you to talk to him again and direct his attention toward the satrap governor somehow. I have access in this matter that no other IMSEC officer could due to my social position. I don't want to see the opportunity wasted, but it also limits me. I can't get at the routine legwork and down and dirty details. I'm too conspicuous. And he points out also earlier, Ivan was saying, like, this is something that the Cetagandans need to work out. And Miles is like, bruh, you tell me how likely you think it is that a Cetagandan takes over this investigation and tries really hard to clear us of blame of everything. And even though I know that there's an ulterior motive to Miles saying this, I understand that Miles just wants to solve this puzzle to a degree and kind of resents the fact that somebody tried to set this up on them. And I feel for him. There is truth to that. I just can't help but think that just happens to be true. You know what I mean? It happens to be true. It's not really his motivation, but it convinces Ivan in the moment. And that's really not that's all he's trying to do here. Um, and then as Ivan leaves, the trouble cause is with your playing the spider in the center of this web, pulling all the strings, is that sooner or later, all the interested parties are going to converge back along those strings to you. You do realize that, don't you? And what are you going to do then, oh mastermind? He bowed himself out with all too effective irony. Miles hunched down in his station chair and groaned and keyed up his list again. I really do appreciate that Ivan isn't a complete idiot. Like he isn't up to it a lot of the time. But in terms of, at the very least, being able to point out things like this. And frankly, I think Miles does need the reminder sometimes. He pretends that he knows what the potential outcomes of things like negatives are going to be, but he just really likes to not think about them, you know? And so he pretends like, yes, I've considered that, but it's like only in the most hypothetical sense, not really. Um, so this next morning is when somebody shows up to talk to Miles. Gem Colonel Dag Benin of Cetaganda Imperial Security. He is an officer of middle rank assigned to internal affairs at the Celestial Garden, and he wants to speak privately with you. This is remarkable. First off, this whole conversation is completely under Miles's control, which watching him work, it's amazing. Secondly, because plenty of people are going to come in and try and control a conversation. That is not new. But because Miles is actually smart, perceptive, good at it, despite how aggressively he kind of takes control of everything, this dude winds up liking him and respecting him by the end of the combo. It is extremely fun to watch. So he's brought to meet him, but the two of them are left alone to talk. He was of no more than middle stature, so probably not overstocked with hot genes in his recent ancestry. The hot favored height. He had likely acquired his present post by merit rather than social rank then, not necessarily a plus from Miles' point of view. Benin was very trim in the dark red Cetagandan dress uniform that was everyday garb for security staff in the Celestial Garden. He wore, of course, full formal face paint in the imperial pattern rather than of his clan, marking his primary allegiance, a white base with intricate black curves and red accents that Miles thought of as the bleeding zebra look. But by association, it was a pattern that would command instant and profound respect and total abject cooperation on 8 planets. Barrier, of course, was not one of them. So he looks like he's around 40 years old, and he seems serious, attentive. He comes in and he's like, "Did you get an explanation of why I'm here?" And Miles comes out with, yes, the shocking death of the Ba that we saw laid out, and really tries to sort of emphasize how embarrassing for you, but not by saying, you know what I'm saying? And then you ruled it was suicide, and Benin is like, yes, but there's clearly, like, this guy is not buying that it's suicide. And Miles pushes about, like, well, okay, clearly from the way that he died, he wasn't brought there. The blood was there. His throat, he was clearly cut on site. However, somebody could have stunned him and carried him there. And there are ways to find out about that with like an autopsy. Did you do that test? Are you aware? And he says, no. Why not? If I were you, it's the first test I'd ask for. Can you get it done now? Though 2 days late is not ideal. The autopsy is over. The Ba has been cremated, Benin said flatly. What? Already? Before the case was closed? Who ordered that? Not you, surely. Not Lord Vorkosigan, this is not your concern. This is not what I came to talk to you about. Why this morbid curiosity about the Celestial Lady's late servant? I thought it was the most interesting thing I'd seen since I came to Eta Ceta. It's in my line, you see. I've done civil security cases at home, murder investigations, successfully, I might add. Does this sort of thing happen here often? No. Benin stared at Miles with intensified interest. I assure you, Lord Vorkosigan, Balora was not carried unconscious into the funeral rotunda, dead or alive. Even the ceremonial guards would have noticed that. Did the slight spin on his tone hint that perhaps the ceremonial guards were chosen for beauty rather than brains? Well, actually, I had a theory, Miles burbled on enthusiastically. You're just the man to confirm or disprove it for me, too. Has anyone testified noticing the Ba enter the rotunda? Not exactly. Ah, yes. And the spot where it lay dead, I don't know what kind of vid coverage you have of the building, but that area had to be occluded. Or it could have not been, what, 15, 20 minutes before the body was discovered, right? Another thoughtful stare. You are correct, Lord Vorkosigan. Normally, the entire rotunda is within visual scan, but because of the height and width of the catafalque, you know what? I'm going to look this word up because I do not know what a catafalque is. Uh, a raised beer box or similar platform, often movable, that is used to support the casket, coffin, or body of a dead person during a funeral or memorial service, following a Roman Catholic requiem mass. Oh, it's specifically mentioning Christianity here. Interesting. Um, so Miles is like, all right, so who would know about that? And then jumps to, are you under pressure to confirm this as a suicide? And the dude gives away clearly in his body language that is exactly what the fuck is happening. And he says, our records indicate you left the reception hall to speak privately with a haute lady. And Miles basically presents that she wanted to know about his like genetics because she thought that he was a mutant when in fact that's like a result of a poisoning rather than genetics. So he makes it seem a little bit more, I guess sordid is the word I'm looking for. Um and it ends with that was the vaguest, convincing sounding, uncheckable bullshit he could come up with on the spur of the moment, and left a good deal of turning room for whatever the colonel had gotten out of Ryan, if anything. What did interest me, though, was the hot lady's force bubble, Miles added. It never touched the ground. She had to be riding in a float chair in there, I figured. They often do, said Benin. That's why I asked you about who saw the Balura enter the chamber. Can anyone use a hot bubble, or are they keyed in some way to the wearer? And are they as anonymous as they look, or do they have some way of telling them apart? And he says that they're keyed, but they have electronic signatures so you can tell who is who. Of course, that is something that maybe people could get around. And Miles is like, well, you see what I'm saying, though. Like, if somebody used that to get in and drop Balura off, like, anybody see hot lady bubbles go in and out? Benin sat back, pursing his lips, regarding Miles with keen interest. You have an alert way of looking at the world, Lord Vorkosigan. 5 boss servants, 4 guards, and 6 hot women crossed the chamber during the time in question. The Ba have duties there, tending to the botanical arrangements and keeping the chamber perfectly clean. The hot women frequently come to meditate and pay respects to the celestial lady. I have interviewed them all. None report noticing Ba Lura. He keeps saying the Ba Lura, and I keep saying Ba Lura just like Ba is his name, but it's a title. So yeah, I really need to stop doing that. Um, you are considering the venue, uh, you are considering the venue of rather low rank for an investigation of this sensitivity, aren't you? That too is my problem. Sacrificable. Benin grimaced. Oh, yes. Nothing Miles had said yet was anything Benin hadn't thought of too, if he dared to speak it aloud. Miles decided to continue sprinkling the favors. You've won yourself quite a pretty problem in this murder, I'd say, Gem Colonel, Miles remarked. Neither of them was keeping up the pretense about the suicide anymore. Still, if the method was as I guess, you can deduce quite a lot about the murderer. His rank must be high, his access to internal security great, and excuse me, he has a peculiar sense of humor. It's motive that troubles me. That harmless old Ba had served in the Celestial Garden for decades. Revenge seems most unlikely. Perhaps. So if Balor is old news, maybe it's the murderer who's newly arrived. And consider decades of standing around, sopping up secrets, the Ba was well placed to know things. So he suggests that maybe the Ba was trying to blackmail somebody. Um, and basically, maybe you should track his movements throughout the day and see whether or not there were places that the ba had gone that could be. And I was sort of interested in this because, like, Miles suggesting that they track the ba's movements when the ba wound up on his ship at one point. I would think Miles would want to direct them away from that line of questioning because he wouldn't want to be connected to this in any way. And I don't know if he like completely had thought that through when he said it or not, because there's no indication in this that he thought about that. But yeah, anyway, uh Benin then is just like, well, do you think that perhaps I could question you about your meeting under Fast Penta? And he says, well, with Ambassador Vorebiev's permission, which of course they both know means that's not happening. Um and Benin gets up to leave. This is so funny. I'm trying to find the spot. How much influence could the satrap governors, all near imperial relations, put on the Celestial Garden's security? Not too much. They were surely regarded as potential threats, but one might have been building up convenient contacts for a long time now. Did anyone care about the murder of a boss slave? How much interest did Benin have in abstract justice? If a Cetaganda couldn't be one up in any other way, holier than thou might do. Miles rose along with Benin and paused. Again, Colonel, may I make a personal suggestion? You have good reason to suspect you have a little problem somewhere overhead, but you don't know where yet. If I were you, I'd go straight to the top. Make personal contact with your emperor. It's the only way you can be sure you've capped the murderer. That high over Lord Vorkosigan, I can hardly claim casual acquaintance with my celestial master. This isn't friendship, it's business, and it's his business. If you truly mean to be useful to him, it's time you began. Emperors are only human. Balura must have been more to him than a piece of the furniture. It served him for over 50 years. Make no accusations. Merely request that he protect your investigation from being quashed. Strike first today before someone begins to fear your competence. I will consider your advice. Good hunting. Big game is the best. Think of the honor. Benin's parting wave was almost, but not quite, a salute. So yeah, the fact that he just absolutely turns this around, not only gets information that he wants to know, but manages to give advice that is probably to his advantage and like get this man's respect so that possibly in the future, if Miles runs into him and wants to ask him something, he will get a real answer from him. That's important. You know, being a person that he feels, even though you are not just potentially part of the investigation, but also an outlander. I mean, the fact that Miles has earned the respect that he has clearly from this man already, that is going to be a big help. It's really funny to me how like Miles was in his mind, he was sort of hoping for this man to be less competent than he turns out to be. But if the man were actually less competent, I don't think that he would have appreciated Miles' handling of this the way that he did. Somebody who is kind of out of their depth, maybe has uncertain footing or is self-conscious about the job they're doing, they are going to be a bit more protective of their information. They're going to see his questions as impertinent, and I think that it would have gone really poorly if Miles had tried this tact. Instead, because Miles himself is so competent, what he is saying is registering and making a lot of sense, and this man can actually appreciate that. But sometimes, if a person is being suggested things that they never thought of, and they are kind of a petty, small person, Rather than appreciating the advice, they get resentful over the fact that something is being suggested that they didn't think of themselves, or something is being suggested, like, covering your ass, basically. The suggestion to do this is an implication, just as Miles said earlier about how he's sacrificable. There's a lot of people that wouldn't want to hear that. They would want to see it as, I'm being put to the test and given the opportunity to show that I am ready for bigger things. But this man has enough presence of mind and experience and maybe cynicism that he understands that that's not what's going on here. So I think that Miles wishing that people were less competent around him because he thinks that will help him, I really think he overestimates how easy it is to manipulate people who are incompetent, because he doesn't understand just how, like, petulant and threatened folks can be really, really quickly. You know what I'm saying? Um, so anyway, I love when he comes out of there and Vorobyev says, a very well conducted interview. Yeah, who had interviewed whom? Um, so Verity is here, and he's like, man, I kind of wish I'd shown up earlier because her funeral was supposed to be real fucking boring, and it turns out there's all kinds of shit happening that I missed. Um, let's see. Some invitations have arrived for you this morning. Ivan took the sheets, their colors and perfumes clashing, and leafed through them in puzzlement. Invitations. Lady Benello invites you to a private dinner. Lady Arvin invites you to a fire pattern viewing party, both tonight. Lady Sendon invites you to observe a court dance practice this afternoon. Lady Sendon is Lady Benello's married sister, according to last night's background checks. Just what did you do to merit the sudden popularity, Lord Vorpatrol? I'm not sure, sir. So Miles is trying to get in on this. Ivan promptly shuts him the fuck down. I swear to God, Ivan. Oh, man. I wish that we got to hear more of his exploits. I would love just for a little side story about Ivan and his, like, sexual exhaustion, because he is being put to work. I have no doubt. Um, so let's see. Oh yeah, this is the moment where Ivan says, I doubt many of Yanaro's crowd have celestial connections. And Miles says, I think that this woman, because he's talking about the one that he walked out with last night, I think this one was an exception, though the people I really want to meet are the satrap governors face to face. So then we go to chapter 8, back at the Celestial Garden. I love how this starts off. The Celestial Garden was not quite so intimidating on the second visit, Miles assured himself. It's giving the same energy as when they were first coming in for a landing in the beginning of the book, where Miles is trying to tell himself, oh, really, Cetaganda is overdone. It's gaudy. It's too much, even though he's sort of like, my God, look at this place. Miles and the ambassador wore their ultra-formal house blacks. Maz wore black linings and pure white overrobes, combining the two mourning colors, acknowledging the Cetagandan hue without overstepping the boundaries of hot privilege. Her dimple flashed with her smile of anticipation and pleasure directed over Miles' head to Ambassador Vorobyev. Are they involved? This didn't occur to me until this moment. I knew that Vorobyev respected her and that they would have to work in close proximity to each other. But I never even considered the fact that they might actually be in a thing together. And now I'm starting to sort of be like, I wonder. Doesn't necessarily matter, but it could, I suppose. I was just, just a little wonder there. Um, Oh, sorry. Jeff is in the chat here. Miles hates when someone gets the last word. I think Miles is all in as if this combo is so exciting he got out of hand. No one wins allies as well as Miles. If I was Miles, I'd totally be like, so they told all their friends how good them fingers are, cuz could it be that it's cuz they're of a similar age? Could it be I'm sorry. I lost track of that there, Jeff. Could what be that they're Oh, do you mean that Maz's reaction to Vorobyev and the fact that they are peers basically is the reason that she seemed so pleased that he was here? It's certainly possible. Like, there's all kinds of reasons why. It just instantly, of course, my mind goes to a romantic connection, but it may not be. I also have to mention that her name being Mia Maz, I absolutely keep doing the Miri Mazdur in my head from A Song of Ice and Fire, and then having to be like, no, Natasha, no, that's not what we're doing, Natasha. Just over and over again, whenever we get her full name. When it's just Maz by itself, it still can make me think of it, but it's not nearly as much as when we get her full name. Um, so To Miles' relief, the ceremony was not carried out in the rotunda with all its alarming associations, where the Empress' body still lay. Neither did the hut use anything so crass as an auditorium with people packed in efficient rows. Instead, the servitor took them to a dell, Miles supposed he might call it, a bowl in the garden lined with flowers, plants, and hundreds of little box seating arrangements overlooking a complex array of daisies and platforms at the bottom. As befitted their rank, or lack of it, the servitor placed the Baryaran party in the last and highest row. And even though it's supposed to sort of be like, yeah, get back there, Miles is like, great, I can see everybody from here. This works perfectly, actually. The description of the Dell, this is so fascinating to me because it's just not when I am trying to picture what things look like in these books. Unfortunately, due to the saturation in my brain of Marvel and Star Wars properties, I have only a very few like mental images, and it's a shame, frankly. Like when I was younger, my brain was so much more elastic and able to come up with ideas that were outside of the box. But as I have gotten older and I have consumed so much media that follows certain tropes, and there's even visual tropes that happen when you start to get more into the way that like certain things are designed, often because they're not even real, they're CGI. I begin to picture things in the same kind of bland way that they are often depicted in these types of like TV shows and movies. And the description of this Dell is so different than it's just so much more complex sounding, so much more beautiful. And I feel like you could try and do it with CGI, but I just think it would be like for the movement of the people around everything, it would be a lot easier probably if you did it with actual practical sets. And I would love to see it. I really would. I just kept trying to imagine like what this would look like. Um so let's see. Miles had spent a great deal of time the last day peering into his comm console display, swatting up background in hopes of finding an end to this tangle. The hot were filtering into their places, men in flowing, snowy robes escorting white bubbles. The dell was beginning to resemble a great bank of white climbing roses in a frenzy of bloom. So the women don't speak today. They have their own ceremony, which that happened yesterday. And then they start with the men of lowest rank. And the 8 satrap governors, assisted by their highest ranking Gem officers, sank into seats around a raised, reserved dais. The governor of Musita was one of the Degtiar constellation, the present emperor's half-uncle, being half-brother to the late empress. Maz, too, watched closely as he settled his aged body creakily into his seat, brushing away his attendants with jerky, irritated motions. The man was very old and very experienced, and had been chosen explicitly to calm Vervani fears of a rematch. The governor of Rosita, Barriar's nearest neighbor, worried Miles a great deal more. The hot Esterond was a middle-aged and vigorous, hot, tall man, though unusually heavy. His gem officer stood well back from his governor's sweeping movements. The governor of Zeta wafted in, proud-nosed. The hot, slight Giaja was what Miles thought of as a typical hot lord. Tall and lean and faintly effeminate. Sorry. I was about to say arrangement. Arrogant, as befit a younger half-brother to the emperor, and dangerous. Young enough to be a possibility, though older than Esterond. And then the youngest, the hot Islam Keti, governor of Sigma Zeta, was a mere stripling of 45 or so. In body type, he was much like Slykiaja, who was in fact a cousin of his through their mothers. His, let's see, it would be, oh, right. Everybody is sort of like interrelated as well, and I'm not even going to bother trying to keep track of that. 8 white bubbles floated into the basin, taking up an arc to the left of the circle. The Gem officers took up a similar arc to the right. They, Miles realized, were going to get to stand through the entire afternoon's ceremony. That, you guys, standing is hard. This is one of those things that, like, it's so hard to explain if anybody hasn't had the kind of job where you stand versus the kind of job where you walk around. But, like, if you know, you know. When I worked as a restaurant hostess and I was standing at a podium all day, it was so much more painful by the end of the day than when I was waiting tables and walking around, or when I was working in the kitchen. And, I would still have to stand in front of like tables and things to do my work, but I would be moving around constantly, getting things, putting things in the cooler, and you just don't notice the same way that you're getting tired because you're not holding one position. And the idea, especially like by the end of this, Miles is losing it because it is so boring. And just the fact that their culture seems made up of so many of these rituals, it was really reminding me in the Sookie Stackhouse books. There is, as there are in so many things, the kinds of differences between werewolf culture and vampire culture. And vampires take themselves a lot more seriously and are extremely big on ritual and like the aesthetic of things. And werewolves they just get things done and they don't care. And there's a moment where some werewolves get exiled from the pack and they're just basically kicked, like literally kicked in the ass as somebody goes, "Go on, get." And Sookie's there with Eric, a vampire, and he basically like puts a hand over his mouth in utter horror at the total lack of ceremony. The fact that they literally just kick them out into the dark, like there's no, and these guys are really giving vampire. They just want to make a thing out of everything. And these people all have to like recite poetry, and they're acting like they wrote it a lot of the time when everybody knows they didn't. And like, come on, poetry, you guys. Poetry can be very moving. I'm not trying to pretend that it's nothing, but you got to be caught in the right headspace. And the poetry has to have a certain level of competence to it. And you have to not have heard similar sentiments 1,100 times already for something to hit. And it just feels like this is a ritual built to make you annoyed and bored, you know? Anyway, so This is the point where Miles is just like, okay, so the celestial bubbles that are opposite the governors, are they? And she says, oh, those are the governor's wives. But it turns out when she uses the word wife, it's not like the way we think of it. There's no actual like personal relationship. They are appointed and called wives, but they are representatives of the Empress in dealings with the Star Crash business. So all of these women, it turns out, are just as possibly involved as the men, if not more likely involved. And Miles, as he realizes that his suspect pool has just doubled, is like, oh my fucking God. And it's made really difficult because culturally he is not supposed to fucking talk to any of them. So how do you get into a position where you can find out anything, you know? Um, so let's see, I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit. Uh, it was the first time in his life Miles had seen the Cetagandan emperor in the flesh, and he studied the man as avidly as he had studied the satrap governors. Emperor the hot Fletcher Giaja was a tall, lean, hawk-faced man like his demi-cousins, his hair still untouched by gray, despite his 70-odd years. A survivor, he had succeeded to his rank at a fantastically young age for a Cetagandan, less than 30, and held on through a wobbly youth to an apparently iron-secure midlife. He seated himself with great assurance and grace of movement, serene and confident, ringed by bowing traders. Miles' nostrils flared, and he took a breath, dizzy with the irony. So they all begin their presentations with their poems. And at first, Miles is just like, wow, this is really something. And he's being genuinely moved by it, I believe. Um, but gradually, Miles began to be aware of stock phrases, repeated ideas. By the 30th man, his eyes were starting to glaze over. And I really appreciate that description. Gradually began to be aware of stock phrases. This is the sort of thing that happens when you get involved in anything new, like a new potentially hobby or a new like a way of thinking. You can see somebody who is sort of the entry that you found into this world, and the way they speak, you'll be like, wow, they put that really well. And then as you begin to soak up more content and information from this particular like group of interests, these people, you begin to realize that like you were giving them a lot of credit for things they said that actually have been said many times before, and that's not a completely original, and that doesn't, excuse me, that doesn't take away from the truth of it, but you know what I mean. You'll really be thinking like, wow, they put that very concisely and succinctly. What a great speaker they are. And then you find out like, okay, well, they may be a good speaker, but many of those things they probably heard somewhere else before. Um, so Miles is looking at all of these different people, trying to figure out who in this crew could possibly be involved. And Miles is like, I really get a vibe from the way this all shook out that whoever was behind this is young ish, maybe only young at heart, but there's something about it to him that doesn't have the flavor of somebody who is older and more cautious, which I think makes sense. Um, he had to lie quiet and do nothing to draw attention to himself, even as it began to look more and more like Balura's death was not going to pass as planned as a suicide. And the droning amateur poets were getting to Miles. He found his subconscious mind not working along with the rest of it as it should, but going off on its own tangent. A Degtiar empress named Lisbeth trapped a satrap lord trapped a satrap lord neatly in his net. Enticed into treason for all the wrong reasons, he'll soon have a crash with his kismet. A beautiful lady named Ryan, hypnotized as a vor scion. The little defective thinks he's a detective, but instead will be fed to the lion. I'll tell you what, guys, I was definitely giggling out loud at these parts. I love this. And the fact that, like, he's not saying these out loud, he is just thinking them and then trying so hard not to laugh. And y'all, if this is not me, I swear, because it's not necessarily like a limerick, but y'all are aware if you've listened to the show that I have that kind of ADD where you say something in the same cadence or phrasing of a pop song, for example, and my brain is off on that song now for at least like 15 seconds. So I'll be in this sort of situation and somebody will say something, and then all of a sudden I'm doing new lyrics to that song in my head. And depending on the situation, I just got to keep it inside, and it can be very, very hard. um, the satrap governor's poems were all excellent, all in the most difficult forms, and Maz informed Miles in a whisper, mostly ghost-written by the best hot women poets in the Celestial Garden. But try as he might, Miles could not read any useful, sinister double meanings into them. His suspect was not using this moment to publicly confess his crimes, put the wind up his enemies, or any of the other really interesting possibilities. Miles was almost surprised. The placement of Balura's body suggested Lord X had a weakness for the Baroque in his plotting, when the simple would have done better. Making an art of it? And then abruptly, the literary ordeal was over. Miles suppressed an impulse to applaud. That was apparently not done. So then we go to the sort of buffet cocktail hour situation. And of course, all of the food is made to look like birds and flowers and yada yada. When Miles is served a plate of rice, the rice is individual grains in a spiral pattern, which is truly beyond belief. Like, can you imagine? If any of you out there have ever worked in catering, can you imagine a group this size and you need to do that with the grains of rice on every plate? And I'm presuming it's every plate because these are all like pretty high up there in terms of social ladder. Oh my god, it's just too much, man. Um, so Maz is trying to give Miles this signal from across the way. And what we find out later is that this woman who had used to be a hot woman in a bubble, now that she has had to suffer a step down in being married to a Gem Lord and no longer has her bubble, this is considered a loss of face, and the very polite thing to do is basically pretend she's still a bubble. But Miles doesn't know that. So I read this section twice, and you can imagine how much more painful it is to read the second time when you know that and you see the way that Miles is behaving because he simply isn't aware and thinks he's being polite in trying to include her when in fact it's like kind of fucked up in their minds. But of course, nobody tells him that because the nature of a place like Cetaganda and the nature of a place that's got all sorts of these involved rules that really depend on people's rank and knowing their rank, the point of those kinds of rules is to identify people who do not belong here, right? That's always what the reason is ultimately is if you know to do the thing, we know you're one of us. And if you don't know to do the thing, we know not to fuck with you. And Miles, unfortunately, really outs himself as somebody not to be fucked with here in a way that I think probably hurts his cause, although it could potentially make them feel like more at ease around him because they don't think of him as somebody of consequence. It can work for you, I guess. Um, and you guys, it's all made worse because the way that Vorobyev introduces him to Governor Rond, the lieutenant takes a very gratifying interest in the finer points of Cetagandan culture. Vorobyev recommended him to the governor's attention. He says that he takes interest in the finer points, and then Miles just goes around like really almost committing a faux pas. Like he really teeters. He doesn't talk to her, but he looks at her. He acknowledges her in a way he's not supposed to. So it's all the more embarrassing. You know, I just hated this. Once I reread it, I was like, oh God, that's so much worse than I recall. Um, and Rond is obviously not really wanting to talk to Miles. It's not totally clear to me if they are like contemptuous of him simply because he's Baryaran and they just think of them as like sort of barbarians. If it's because he looks like a mutant and they are such racist, like, you know what I mean? It may be a combo. But whatever it is, this dude is very eager to get rid of him. Uh, and Miles keeps trying to insert little double-edged meanings into the conversations that he's having to see what kind of responses he's getting. And he isn't getting any bites. Like, he's saying to himself, all of the people here are so controlled that even when they're not lying, it still kind of seems like they're lying. And I thought that was so interesting. You know, the idea of that infiltrating things and making it seem, even when you're telling the truth, like you're kind of not. I've been rewatching the TV series The Mentalist, and it's so silly. It's a really fun show, actually. Like, it holds up much better than I was ever expecting. Um, but there is like a thing where the main character can tell when people are lying all the time. And he has only ever been wrong like twice. And it always struck me as sort of like, you know, there's lots of different types of lying. And I don't necessarily think you can always tell. So that always struck me as sort of like, yeah, all right. Like, come on, it's not a superpower. Um, so yeah, he's talking to the Ron and he says, we know about Yanaro. And Ron is just like, I beg your pardon, and doesn't seem to get it at all. Um, and then we have Ketty, what is his full name? I'm trying to find it. Ilsum Ketty, attended by his Gem General, who also kept a hot wife on standby. She was extraordinary, even by hot standards. Her hair was a rich, dark chocolate color, parted in the middle and gathered in a thick braid that trailed down her back to actually coil upon the floor. Her skin was vanilla cream, her eyes, widening slightly as she glanced down at Miles approaching by the Ron's side, were an astonishingly light cinnamon color, large and liquid. I was sort of like, obviously, in this universe, guys, so far we have had almost no characters who aren't white. And all of the extraordinarily beautiful women are definitely white, which I don't know if that's explicitly part of the deal with Cetaganda, is that their racism is like as basic as whiteness, but I have to assume, right? But anyway, I couldn't help but laugh at the fact that he was like glad that he had been desensitized to the beauty of hot women by meeting Ryan, because if he hadn't, he probably would have fucked up even worse, even earlier with this woman. Um, the Rond took the opportunity to skim Miles off his hands and escape to the buffet. The irritated Ketty was failing to perform his social duties. And yet, Miles is trying to make conversation. This guy is such a dickhead. And Miles does the whole, like, it's an honor to meet you and your fine lady. I don't believe I know her name. He smiled hopefully at her. And he doesn't get anything from that because, again, he's not meant to look at her. He's not meant to speak to her or about her. Like, Miles says, I understand we have a mutual hobby. Oh, said Ketty unencouragingly. An interest in the Cetaganda and Imperial regalia, such fascinating sets of artifacts, and evocative of the history and the culture. I would not regard that as a pastime, nor a suitable interest for an outlander. It's a military officer's duty to know his enemies. I would not know. Those tasks belong to the Gem. Such as your friend Lord Yanaro? A slender reed for you to lean on, Governor, I'm afraid you are about to find. Ketty's pale brow wrinkled. Who? So yeah, he's not getting stuff. Eventually, he's like, can you introduce me to Governor Giaja? Because I think that he's sort of my opposite number. And Ketty just says, I doubt Slike would think so. By the look on his face, he was balancing the annoyance to Prince Slike Giaja of inflicting the Outlander on him versus the relief of being rid of Miles himself. And eventually he brings Miles over. Miles says, if you can't speak with me, would you deliver a message? Yanaro is ours. And he delivers the message. The man does not seem to have any real response, just sort of waves him off, and then won't speak to him, is too busy to see him. Thank you anyway. Miles stared around, wondering how to leverage access to his next prospect. The Moose-Eaton governor was not present. Mia Maz drifted up. Finding any good conversation? Not so far. Yourself? I would not presume. I've been mostly listening. And this is when he finds out about what he's supposed to do with the Gem women who had been hot women. And how, like, narrowly he avoided really, really fucking up. Miles became aware of a ghostly gray presence at his elbow and tried not to jump. It was the Rien Degtiar's little Ba servant. My lady wishes to speak with you, said the Ba. Maz's eyes widened. Thank you. I would be pleased, Miles responded. Maz, would you be so kind as to tell the ambassador I've gone to speak with a lady? I may be some time. I'll catch you back at the embassy. I don't think, began Maz doubtfully, but Miles was already turning away. He shot her a smile over his shoulder and a cheerful little wave as he followed the Ba out of the pavilion. And that is the end of the chapter. So I am going to have to wrap this up. I'm over time, but I really don't know where we're going here. So I'm excited to see. I really am. All right, guys. Thank you all again so much for hanging out with me. Thank you, Jen, for commissioning this episode. And thank you all of you who were able to come to the lives. Sorry, I'm not able to interact more with the comments, but I am always so over time that I have to really limit myself. And I hope you understand, but I appreciate you. So until next time, guys, I'll see you Thursday. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.